I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at the latest tactical and strategic updates from the ground, and I ask my guests whether Joe Biden's gaffes over Ukraine are derailing the West's response.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's day 33, and today I'm joined by Dominic Nicholls, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Olivia Utley, Assistant Comment Editor, and Francis Dearnley, also Assistant Comment Editor. Dominic Nicholls, what happened over the weekend? Can you give us the latest update?
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody. It's been, in the words of the British MOD's Defence Intelligence, a very quiet few days. I mean, you could have read that from a week or so ago. But continued pressure, extreme pressure in Mariupol to the south. Pressure also in the area of the Donbass. We'll talk about that a bit later, I'm sure. And Kharkiv to the north. However, not a huge amount around the capital, Kyiv, in the north. In fact, there's been some indication that Russian forces have been not withdrawing, but doing what's called a relief in place. So moving some of the units that are exhausted out of that area to be replaced by other fresher troops. We've mentioned before that those fresher troops are probably going to be lower training level, possibly conscript troops. But it's noteworthy they need to sort of replace and start sort of bringing in fresh troops and what they thought was going to be a very quick assault. Notable also that they seem to be withdrawing back through the area around Chernobyl, which is quite a smart tactical move, you've got to say, because it's extremely unlikely that Ukrainian forces would want to try and chase them into there or have any kind of extreme kinetic military effect against them in there for fear of blowing up all the dust on the ground. We saw when in the first few hours of the war, first few days, when they came down through Chernobyl, there was a spike in radiation. That's not because anything leaked out. It was just the dust and earth and everything being chucked up from the ground because of the extra footfall. So a rather smart move there by Russia. And just in the west, a rocket fire into Lviv, the town near the Polish border, which saw a fuel depot and an artillery repair factory hit by Russia. But generally, fairly quiet overall. There's another couple of points to pick out, but I'll pause there.
Thanks, Dom. There was something that took my eye in the paper today, that a Russian tank battalion that made its name at Stalingrad has been destroyed. Do you want to speak a bit about that? Yeah,
Russia's 4th Guards tank division, was badly mauled. Now, trying to put a doctrinal term of defeat or destroy, and I get all my staff college terminology wrong here, but one means to completely wipe it out and the other is to render it combat ineffective. But if the unit's combat ineffective, but they still got 3 T-72 tanks staring at you, they can do an awful lot of damage. But yeah, effectively, this tank division that can trace its roots back to the siege of Stalingrad in the Second World War, which many see as the turning point in the Second World War, was effectively neutralised and taken off the orbit. Is no longer a fighting force worthy of the name. So we've seen great success, obviously, by Ukrainian forces in many areas around the country, but this is it not only relieves the pressure from the area in the east, it was just to the south of Kharkiv, but it's a totemic force. This, as I say, Stalingrad holds a special place in the hearts of the Russian military. So to lose such a significant division there will really resonate with them.
Thanks very much, Dominic Nicholls. Francis and Olivia, is there anything else you think we should talk about before moving on to speak about Biden? I mean, off the top of my head, just looking at my notes, there's Ukrainian politicians accusing refugee agencies of mishandling their response to the humanitarian crisis. And there's, after interviews with Western press, Volodymyr Zelensky has accused the West of cowardice and lashed out at the West's ping-pong approach to diplomacy. Do either of you want to come in on that and explain a bit about what he means?
Yes, thank you, David. Well, I'm happy to talk about the very interesting interview that Mr. Zelensky gave, or President Zelensky, should I say, whilst in Kiev. In a sense, it's repeating the line that he's been making privately, certainly to the British government and others, that he sees the British support of his country as being far greater than that offered by others. And in the interview, and I'll quote, he says, to be honest, Johnson, that being Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, is a leader who is helping more. The leaders of countries react according to how their constituents act. In this case, Johnson is an example. So obviously they're speaking to the nature of the British defiance. And he continued in this interview in The Economist by saying, Britain is definitely on our side, whilst Germany is making a mistake today as it tries to balance its ties to Moscow. Britain wants Ukraine to win and Russia to lose, but I'm not ready to say whether Britain wants the war to drag on or not. So not completely going all in support of the Prime Minister and of Britain, obviously holding a little few cards close to his chest, but more broadly he is underlining the support that Britain has offered him in contrast to the French and the Germans, clearly in an attempt to pressurise both of those countries into offering more in terms of weaponry. We've spoken before on this podcast about the nature of the German offering, which was initially only 5,000 helmets, which now seem an almost insulting offer to the Ukrainian people. And I think all of this aligns with what we saw in a poll only a couple of weeks ago, that the Ukrainian people of all of the European countries see the British support as being the greatest of all of the European countries that have offered support. So this will be pleasing reading for Number 10 Downing Street in terms of the support that they have offered to the Ukrainian people. And it also goes without saying that almost all military analysis think that were it not for the training that British soldiers offered the Ukrainian army in the weeks and months and years prior to the invasion, that it is unlikely that the Ukrainians would have been able to resist as effectively as they have. So I think, we are by nature as journalists always looking to be critiquing governments, and rightly so. But this is one of those opportunities where it's actually we can celebrate something that a government has done and has effectively seems to have neutralised much of the Russian threat, and that there's something to be said for that in these challenging times.
I think it's worth a word too about what is going on in Germany, because Scholz has obviously become very hawkish on Russia in recent weeks. He's cancelled the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is huge, really, and is now kind of making all the right noises. It's a bit late, but he's getting the right tack. But and Francis touched on this too. It's not going to be easy for him. He's now, Zelensky's probably going to have kinder words to say about Scholz in the weeks ahead. Now he's rowing back on all of this pro-Russia strategy which Merkel had in place. But there's a large part of Scholz's party, the SPD party, which has had cosy links with Russia for many, many years. And I think the idea that Scholz will just be able to sort of turn this ship immediately is a little bit naive. And it's already clear that he's a bit nervous about what the rest of his government and party think of his now very hawkish take on Russia, because he's not even telling them what he's doing before he does it. So, it feels as though Germany is headed in the right direction now, but I'm not sure if it'll be that simple for Scholz. I think he is going to face a little bit of a backlash in some way from his party, who won't want to cut these very, very useful links with the Kremlin that abruptly.
If I could just jump in there and say that I had a very interesting interview with Dr. Thomas Clausen in the Friday episode of this podcast, who touched a lot on what Olivia was just saying. And his one of the central points that he was making is that there is actually a big discrepancy between the way that the German population and people think about Russia, aka with a lot of scepticism and frustration, and the way in which the political elites in Germany, think about Russia. And this is going to be one of the big hurdles that Olaf Scholz is going to have to overcome. But it's obviously always a problem when you have discrepancy between the way the political class and the ordinary people think towards the country. I mean, I was very struck by a poll that was done only a few weeks ago asking for the British public's view on Vladimir Putin. And as you can imagine, they had very, very strong views on the matter. But my pet theory would be that if you'd asked that same question about the British public's opinion of Vladimir Putin, they would have said the exact same critiques 5, 10, 20 years ago. And yet, the West's response towards Russia has not been as strong as perhaps the British public and other European populations would have liked to have seen. And this is the consequence of that. So that, once again, unfortunately, countries have been let down by their political elites on this issue. And hopefully this should be the lesson that things need to change. But am I optimistic? Not necessarily. As I say, to Olivia's point, already we've seen a little bit of backtracking from the German government about the scale of their rearmament and other things. And so the pressure must be kept up if from the populations of these countries, if they wish to see their governments to continue the pressure on Russia.
Thanks, Francis. Thanks, Olivia. Dom, very quickly, would you give us a bit of a preview? I note that you're writing some analysis for the Telegraph newspaper on some weapon systems, remote mining systems, and you're asking the question about how we can put the West's rhetoric into practice. If you were going to send tanks to Ukraine, how exactly do you do that? Would you give us a bit of a preview about your thoughts on what you're writing?
Yeah, so this is looking at what additional support can be sent. President Zelensky's asked for tanks and planes and suggested that NATO could supply 1% of the tanks, and that'd be a great addition. And I mean, it would in terms of numbers, but of course, there's more to having something, or more to being able to use something than just having it. I mean, many of us listening to this can drive a car, but if I presented you with a Formula One race car and said, "Can you take my granny to Glasgow?" and you said, "Well, no, of course not," I said, "Well, why not? You can drive, can't you?" And this is a similar thing. I mean, Ukraine uses Soviet or former Soviet Russian tanks, mainly T-72, and so just the thought of suggesting old tanks or British Challengers and Leopards and Leclercs and maybe even M1 Abrams, although they're extremely thirsty and the price of gas is going up. But it's just not credible to say let's send these tanks over there, because having them is one thing, being able to operate them is something else. Being able to support them, have the needs of ammunition, etc., etc. But it is worth having the conversation. There are a lot of T-72s still around in NATO, in former Warsaw Pact countries, many of them in storage, but then they're kept in storage so that they can be used at some point in the future. They should be, just as the British Army keeps a load of old kit in Ludgershall in the eastern end of Salisbury Plain. I mean, these tanks are there, especially sort of temperature controlled and humidity controlled warehouses, so they can be used. And Poland has 300. Czech Republic 100, Hungary about 40, Slovakia about 30 T-72s. They could be some deal done over them. We saw with the Rentamig affair that a country going out on a limb and offering heavy metal is quite a political act. Well, I mean, it's all a political act, clearly, but there's a difference between sending helmets and ammunition to sending MiG fighters and tanks. And so some of these countries might feel a little bit out on the limb, would want some political cover for that, might even want something in return, some kit, other tanks or another nature. There was suggestion that the MiG-29s from Poland might have been backfilled by F-16s, for example. So there's deals that can be done there, but it's not just as simple as saying there's kit over there, let's get it into Ukraine. There's a training bill, as I've described. There's also, well, how do you do that? How do you get the stuff there? If you put tanks on a low loader on a vehicle that can carry the immense weight of a tank or a train, for example, and get it into Ukraine, does the driver hop out and the Ukrainian driver jump in because it's then a legitimate target? Or are you spreading the nature of the war by having these things prepared outside of Ukraine, or taking Ukrainian soldiers out of the country to train them on the next series of air defense weapons that you're going to supply? So as the nature of the ask gets bigger, so too to the political ramifications of any country's offering. And so we're at the point now where the fight is moving towards the bigger natures of equipment, and for example, seeking to go after the long-range Russian artillery, the kind of stuff that's going to interdict that, going to attack that, is not. You're moving away from the very simple to use, simple to operate kit, and that then brings a whole heap of questions about who does it, where do you do it, what kind of numbers. Are they doing it on their own? Are they doing it under the banner of NATO? And if they do so under the banner of NATO, is that too much, too escalatory? So a whole heap of questions around what might be a relatively straightforward ask of, can I have your spare tanks?
Thank you very much, Dom. I thought that was incredibly insightful and gives us a sense of the scale of the challenge, logistical and political, that awaits countries and leaders who offer their support. So turning to, I think, our main question for this space, I want to talk a bit about Joe Biden. He's been visiting Europe and he made quite a large gaffe. The fallout is dominating our headlines. Our front page today was on it. Olivia Utley, would you tell us what he said and what happened? What was the initial reaction?
So he was making quite a good speech generally in Warsaw, and then he said this line right at the end, which was clearly off script. He said, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power," talking about Putin. Obviously, that is not the general Western line, that we're in this war to get Putin out. And in fact, there's no way that the West can possibly, oust Putin from his position as the president of Russia. And then Biden's White House representatives immediately corrected the president and said he didn't mean out of power in Moscow, he meant out of power in Ukraine. But clearly, Putin, who is always looking for reasons for excuses to up the attack, will take that as confirmation of his paranoid theory that the West is trying to get rid of him. So it was a really sort of stupid and quite dangerous thing for Biden to say.
If I could just jump in there, I think it's something that, just to Olivia's point, that this now, it does feed into a narrative, unfortunately, within Russia, that America's objective all along has been to not only overthrow Putin, but to actually destabilize and sort of divide Russia from within. So that, I think, is why this can be described as a gaffe. I mean, when you've got your own team after you've said something, having to immediately clarify your remarks, this is not a show of strength that you would hope to have a president doing. But I do think that actually it speaks to, in defence of President Biden, it does speak to the challenge moving forward in terms of handling the Ukraine crisis, which is effectively, do we, or when I say we as the West, do we really say that we are willing, once the Ukraine crisis is over, to continue to deal with Vladimir Putin, who has already been described as a war criminal by the international community? Are we really saying that as part of some future peace deal that we would be willing to ease sanctions on Russia under Putin's leadership? I mean, these are very challenging questions to be asking, but they are relevant to this, because if the answer is no, then we should be sending a very clear signal to the Russian people and to the Russian oligarchs and the kleptocracy that Putin cannot remain in power and your country not be a pariah state. And that will send a very clear message to them. But as I say, the challenge is that does that play more into Putin's hands, or does that play more into those who wish to challenge Putin or to the Russian people? That is a very open question, but I think it's very, very relevant to this, and it will become increasingly relevant in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, I think what Biden has a sort of knack for doing is saying what everyone else is sort of thinking. And of course, we are kind of thinking to ourselves over here, how on earth can, after all this, how on earth can the West go back to, business as usual with Russia if Russia is still operating under Putin? And I think it's true that if you read Biden's words as a sort of, that he was speaking to the Russian people sort of over the heads of the president, saying, you've got to get rid of this man, then there is a sort of defense of it. But it is kind of hard to defend, because we as the West can't, we don't have any control over Russian democracy. We don't, who gets into power in Russia isn't really our business, and we can't really frame the war in those terms. So to sort of pretend that we can probably isn't particularly productive, and could cause an awful lot of problems further down the line. And it's not the first time that Joe Biden's done this. He speaks out of turn, and his White House representatives have to row back on what he said moments later, relatively often. He said last week even that the US would respond in kind if Russia used chemical weapons, and the White House had to clarify what he meant without actually saying what he did mean. So I think he is, it's loose talk, and it is definitely becoming a little bit dangerous.
We published a piece on our desk, I think it was only last week, where somebody called Biden the commentator-in-chief, which I think is perhaps quite a good way of describing him to Olivia's point. There was just one other point I wanted to make on this question of the Russian people and an update on them. That's obviously been a consistent question that we've asked over the course of the last few weeks on this podcast, is the extent to which the Russian people will be now looking at Putin in a different way, and whether they'll be looking to challenge him, etc. And we've had, of course, many different responses to that question, some being more optimistic and some much more pessimistic. There's been a very interesting piece I just wanted to point people to in Vanity Fair, an interview with the author Mikhail Zygar. And he makes the point, which I think just underlines something we've said on this podcast before, which is, in his view, and he actually, I think, phrases it in a very similar way to the way that we did, which is, he was asked, do I believe that Russia can be transformed into some kind of North Korea? My answer is yes, and Putin is okay with that. Lenin, 100 years ago, called the intelligentsia, the educated class of Russia, and then he's expletive here, of the nation. And that is exactly the phrase Putin would agree with. So according to his mindset, he is just getting rid of the expletive. So this, again, is speaking to something we were talking about last week, which is that the elites, now perhaps as many as 500,000 young people, educated people, have left the country. And this arguably plays into Putin's hands, because if they've left, then they are not going to be there to challenge him, and those that remain are going to be less likely to do so. And as I've said before, if you look at the states where there have been revolutions in the past, or leaders who have been overthrown, then you usually have to have coherent blocks of people, classes of people who are there, who are ready to move in to any vacuum of power that is emptied. And unfortunately, when you've got so many people leaving Russia who are perhaps more liberal-minded, more westernized, that is not a good sign to a future Russia that is going to be one that cooperates with the rest and acts in a different way than Vladimir Putin has done. So I know I've made that point several times on this podcast, but I think it's really, really important when thinking long-term in the context of the Russian state.
Thank you very much, Francis. You're dead on, I think. Dom Nichols, you've written quite a lot of analysis on Biden's gaffes. What's your take on it after Olivia and Francis?
Well, I agree with Olivia and Francis, the points they've made there. And I mean, there's a lot of criticism that it's not a gaffe for calling out Putin for what he is. However, I would counter that actually it is. If you're the president of the United States, there's ways of saying these things and ways of not doing it, or ways of making the situation worse. And I think he has possibly made the situation worse. And I think if you have to, almost the definition I would suggest of a political gaffe is if your team have to come out in the minutes after you said it and start saying, well, no, actually, what he meant was this. I remember markedly when, backtracking a little bit, but I remember that George W. Bush's team complained to Al Jazeera after 9/11, or in the years after 9/11, about how much airtime Osama bin Laden was given. And Al Jazeera did crunch the numbers and then went back to them and said, actually, over the last 12 months, George W. Bush has had more airtime. There have been more times we've had the camera on him, and he's speaking his words, we're listening to his words, than Osama bin Laden. Now, what you do with that time you're given as a politician, and what comes out of your mouth, and what is received by the audiences, plural, that you are addressing, that's up to you. But you can't complain that the that the media organisation doesn't give you a fair crack of the whip. So I think if you're given airtime and then your team have to come straight out afterwards and say no, he didn't mean that, he meant this, that is a political gaffe. And the reason I think it's serious is because Putin, to a very great extent, sees himself as the embodiment of the Russian state. He is Russia. He cannot fail because that is Russia failing. NATO has a go at him because NATO is having a go at the Russian people in his mind. And the reason that's really important is because he and his sort of security establishment have made no bones about the fact that they see it would be entirely legitimate and appropriate to use nuclear weapons if there's an existential threat to the state. So if you take out the word state and put Putin, and he sees a threat to his leadership or some kind of call perhaps saying he needs to be overthrown or he needs to be kicked out or any a sort of whiff of the International Criminal Court in the background, then I think that takes us into a very, very dangerous place regarding nuclear weapons. So I just say, and as I've echoed today in the Dispatch's newsletter that's going to come out in about 4 or 5 hours' time, please sign up. I just say, look, you've just got to be better than this. If you're the president of the United States, it should be no surprise that someone's going to stick a camera in front of you and a microphone. And if you're on stage, well, guess what? We're going to listen to every single word you say. And you've just got to be better at it. Use language better. Words count. Words matter. This is important stuff at a very dangerous time.
I think it's just worth reflecting as well about Joe Biden as a foreign policy president. And he's obviously been in the United States foreign policy space for many decades now. And if you look at his previous decisions or suggestions, they have not necessarily been the right ones. We've got a piece in the paper tomorrow by Robin Renwick, who's the former ambassador to the United States, and his sort of central thesis is that Biden is weak precisely because he thinks he's a foreign policy expert. And if you look at Afghanistan and the chaotic withdrawal only a few months ago, if you look at the fact that President Biden, when he was the vice president, was one of the very, very few who advised President Obama not to seek to capture or assassinate Osama bin Laden, he has not got a good track record. And clearly, this latest gaffe or misspeak, whichever you want to use, is yet another that can be chalked up to that. However true it may be, to Dom's point, if you're president of the United States, these things really, really matter and can be used by your enemies against you. And as I say, that is now what is going to be happening in Russia, that they will be repeating this line and say, if you don't support President Putin's war in Ukraine, then you are effectively pro an America that wants to see a regime change, that wants to see Putin removed from power, and that ultimately wants to destabilize and arguably destroy Russia. Now, we know that's not true. We know that would be propaganda, but that is what your enemy can use. And as I say, to Dom's point, there was the line during the war that careless talk costs lives. It was one of the famous wartime posters here in Britain, and I think you could say that this is a further example of that, albeit in a different space.
Could I just ask, do we have much sense of how this has gone down in the US? What's been the reaction of political elites and the public?
From what I've seen, I think that you've got the Republican wing, who obviously have been very critical and continue to be critical of President Biden, and look to these kind of gaffes as being yet further example of Sleepy Joe, to quote Donald Trump. But there's been a sort of noticeable silence, I think, on the Democratic wing in terms of criticising Biden, because he's sometimes, I think, seen as the man who can do no wrong. And I think part of the reason for that is that they are still very aware that Trump is in the wings, perhaps for a future presidential election or a resurgent Republican Party. They know that he is a very unpopular president at home, and he's got also a very unpopular vice president. And so there's this sort of rallying around Biden, which I don't think have happened if Donald Trump was still in power, because they fear that what could happen as a consequence of that. But the American people, I think, will very clearly see that this is a misstep if they're following it perhaps as closely as we are. And I think that's another important point to underline is I think that this is not as big a story in America, the Ukraine crisis, as it is here in Europe for obvious reasons. But there is, of course, a problem with that when you've got America still being the leader of the free world. You want them to be as closely engaged in Europe as they were in the Cold War, and they are arguably currently not. But whether that will shift over the coming years ahead, if we are in Cold War II, as has been, we've already described this as possibly being, then we would hope to see that shift in the months ahead.
Olivia and Dom, I don't know if either of you want to come in on that.
Well, I've seen a bit of comment from the American right wing, Mark Hertling, for example, saying that it's well, he tweeted, I'm looking at it now, saying whether or not it was an emotional ad lib or a gaffe, it may not be presidential language, but it was something he needed to say, and said Putin's a combination of Milosevic, Ceausescu, and yes, Hitler. It's a message to Europe and Moscow. So it's kind of it's given that wing of the debate a breath of life. No, I mean, you pay your money, take your choice. I think that's unhelpful to let those ideas run too far. But others clearly disagree, which I have no problem with at all. But it certainly has allowed these ideas that people say, yes, it was a gaffe, but it needed to be said. I'm not sure it did need to be said. I think most people who are intelligent consumers of information have read the papers, watched the news, and can see what's going on. I think this was, well, we know it's off the cuff, unscripted remarks, but it has been a gift to Putin. And why would you want to do that?
Yeah, I think it's sort of interesting the extent to which Biden's gaffe seem to be priced in America. I mean, of course, it's very true that the war in Ukraine generally isn't quite as much of a topic in America as it is over here. But the extent to which this hasn't really been picked up on, there are the Republicans and anti-Biden people who are saying exactly what you'd expect them to say. But no one seems to be shocked, and that's because he does do it quite a lot. People are just kind of used to it, and they've kind of accepted that that's the president that they've got, which I think is quite sort of damaging in itself, because if there's not a big reaction to this, which obviously is a gift to Putin, then how far can he go? How many off the cuff bizarre remarks can he make before anyone around him actually properly challenges him? It's worryingly priced in.
I think, just to Olivia's point, there's a broader question here, which is that is America weaker under President Biden on the world stage than it was under President Trump and in previous administrations? I think a lot of commentators have argued that it is weaker, and I think some of the reasons for that are obvious. Obviously, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I've already mentioned, was terrible optics. It's not only in terms of the horrific suffering endured by those who were left behind, and we've already seen what's been happening to women in that country, but also the message it sent in terms of Western American values towards the rest of the world, that essentially is wanting to be more isolationist, not to have forever wars, which was a phrase actually used by President Biden. And this is a gift, an absolute gift to opponents of the Western worldview, because not only does it make clear what the Western policy is, but also it's being articulated aloud. And it's a point I know we've made before, but you shouldn't be, when you're in a position, particularly when it involves in military and foreign policy affairs, of always articulating exactly what you are going to do and how you are going to behave. That plays into your enemy's hands. And yet President Biden has an awful habit of doing just that, because he says what he's, for example, on Ukraine, he said that we will not intervene and risk war with Russia. Well, why do you need to tell the Russians that under no circumstances will you intervene? It just gives them a blank check to commit the kind of atrocities that we've seen. But as I say, to the broader point of American foreign policy strength under Biden, I don't believe, genuinely, I don't believe that this would have occurred under President Trump. And I say it for the simple reason that President Trump was extremely unpredictable, that he would be swung this way and that by what people were saying in America, what the latest piece of news that he'd seen seen on Fox News, and it's dangerous when you've got somebody who is unpredictable. It means that you are not sure how they're going to react, and it means that you're less likely to take risks. And I think Vladimir Putin would have thought, I cannot risk there being some sort of escalation here, which involves American troops, because I know I will lose. And I think he probably saw the withdrawal in Afghanistan in the weeks prior to him seriously considering the invasion in Ukraine, and thought, well, I can say with confidence that the Americans will not intervene militarily. Now, of course, he has made some other miscalculation about the scale in which the West has been united by this. We obviously saw the NATO summit last week. But even so, he has been right in that assumption that America would not intervene militarily and introduce a new no-fly zone. And that's, as I say, it's played into his hands. So my own feeling is that, yes, America is diminished, unfortunately, and that a future president will have to try and really reassert the fight for freedom on the international stage that a president like Ronald Reagan articulated so vividly. There needs to be somebody who is making those kind of speeches that many of people will have seen Arnold Schwarzenegger making only a couple of weeks ago, articulating what freedom means, and doing so in a really effective way. Because at the moment, it feels like the West is being led, in a sense, by Volodymyr Zelensky. And there's good reasons for that, but it should really be coming from the President of the United States and the leader of the free world. And we're not there, and we should be.
Thank you very much, Francis. Just before we wrap up and we look to the week ahead, Dom, I know you mentioned you had some further analysis on some of the things happening in Ukraine. Do you want to talk us through it?
Yeah, well, not so much in Ukraine, but just around the edges. And we've spoken before about Putin's, one of the reasons he suggests he went into this, because he didn't want more NATO on his borders, and of course that's exactly what he's got. But beyond that, we've spoken before about the positions of countries like Sweden and Finland, who are are close to NATO, joint exercises and what have you, but have resolutely stayed outside. And we've questioned, is this enough to make them want to join? A couple of weeks ago, in fact, 2 days, I can remember exactly, 2 days before the war started, on the Tuesday, I was at an event where I was chatting to the Swedish Defence Minister, Peter Hultqvist, and I was asking him about the old canard of when Sweden going to join NATO, and he said, "Oh, crikey, we don't need to go around that buoy again." He said, "We're basically so close, we've got so many bilateral ties that we're kind of a part of it anyway." And I thought, well, no, you're not, mate. I mean, there's a big old Article 5 elephant in the room. But apart from that, delighted to chat, Minister. And then I just saw this morning, Francis Tusa, the defence journalist, he tweeted from a flight tracking site, saying that there was a Swedish Gulfstream 4 SIGINT, signals intelligence platform, doing some racetrack circuits up and down the Polish border, clearly having a nice a look at what's going on, and good look at Kaliningrad as well. And it was almost in lockstep with a US rivet joint, again another signals intelligence platform, an RC-135 rivet joint, and they were all about 5,000 or 6,000 feet apart in altitude, but they were pretty close and doing identical racetrack circuits. These things don't happen by accident. They weren't just in the same area. It's all Polish airspace, clearly. They were obviously deconflicting with each other, making sure there were nobody got too close, and there wasn't an aviation safety incident. But it almost certainly goes beyond that, and there must have been some kind of, if not intelligence sharing, but then in sorting out who's going to look at what, and at some level, some military cooperation. So I just thought that was interesting about the position of countries like Sweden and Finland and where they are regarding the threat from Russia, what's going on in Ukraine, and their relationship and interaction with NATO. So yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. You can have a look at Francis's feed. He's always a good guy to keep an eye on.
Thank you very much, Dom. I think we've probably come to the end of our time together. Olivia, Francis and Dom, can I get your final thoughts? What's really struck you about this conversation, and what should we be looking for in the weeks ahead?
I think I would just make a comment on the morale of the Russian soldiery. Imagine for a moment that you are a Russian conscript that was sold a war, and that you would be liberating a country full of Nazis, and that you'd be treated as liberators. Then your tanks or your munitions rolls in, and you face the kind of resistance they did in those early hours and early days. And you're now outside Kiev. It's bitterly cold. You're not prepared for the fight that you've received. Morale is already low. And then, at the end of last week, your leader says that the fight for Kiev is effectively redundant and that the shift will be more towards the east. Imagine how you would feel. And I think that this is a question that we, as Dom has obviously been talking about every day since his podcast began, that the Russian army is not in a good place, and it is arguably already past the point where it would ever be able to achieve its fundamental objectives in Ukraine. So my final question, or thinking ahead, is what if the Russian army is truly on its last legs, as some commentators have made? What does that mean for the peace talks that are taking place, and what does that mean for Putin as well? Because if the Russian army really does collapse, and this is an absolute victory for the Ukrainians, which would be an absolutely remarkable achievement, then that has huge ramifications for both the peace talks and for Putin's presidency. And so if that is a likelihood, I would just say that it's something that we're going to need to return to on a future podcast.
Very, very quickly, I'd be really interested to hear from NATO. I can see there's some NATO officials listening into this, so please do get in touch. Really interested in the position NATO's in at the moment, not only about military support and we talked about the tanks earlier on and other equipment, but at what point these become bilateral deals, or is it NATO? Plus, I just mentioned Sweden, but the relationship with other interested parties, and the Secretary General has just been extended in post for a year from I think this autumn to next summer or thereabouts. So to tide us over for this current crisis, hopefully tide us over this current crisis, but deemed not the best time to move Secretary General. So I'd really be interested to hear after the NATO meeting last week a sort of view on some of these areas. But that's one for another time. But any NATO officials listening in, I'd love to get in touch with you.
I don't think the Biden row is over yet. The response from Peskov, as Russian spokesperson, was this speech and the passages which concern Russia is astounding, to use polite words. He doesn't understand that the world is not limited to the United States and most of Europe. They've said they're going to watch very closely what Biden says in the weeks ahead. So Russia's clearly, Biden has poked the bear very clearly. And whether the Kremlin will just let this slide will be very interesting to see. And if it feels a little bit as though Biden is being watched even more closely now, and we know that pretty much every time he makes a speech, he does come out with some slightly odd remark, if not a gaffe. So how that relationship develops and what the fallout will be, I think we haven't yet seen the last of it, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the days and weeks ahead.
To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you found this show helpful, follow Ukraine, the latest, on your podcast app. And if there's something we could do to make it even more useful, do let us know. You can email podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Sophie Coe.